Essay 4 in Studies in Pessimism is titled Immortality, a Dialogue. The title is T. Bailey Saunders' title, and he begins this essay with a translator's footnote. Saunders writes, "The word immortality, Unsterblichkeit, does not occur in the original, nor would it, in its usual application, find a place in Schopenhauer's vocabulary. The word he uses is Unzerstörbarkeit, indestructibility. But I have preferred immortality, because that word is commonly associated with the subject touched upon in this little debate. If any critic doubts the wisdom of this preference, let me ask him to try his hand at a short, concise, and at the same time popularly intelligible rendering of the German original, which runs thus: Zur Lehre von der Unzerstörbarkeit unseres wahren Wesens durch den Tod, kleine dialogische Schlussbelustigung." Okay. I'm not going to try my hand at translating that. I'll just say that it's important for us to remember that although the title is Immortality, the subject is indestructibility, the question of whether the soul, specifically the individual soul, is destroyed or annihilated at death. We might say the question here is not where will I go, but will I be me after my death? This is a dialogue between two characters, Thrasymachus and Philalethes. Thrasymachus we recognize as the obnoxious interlocutor from the early books of Plato's Republic. We should expect to hear from him a viewpoint which is both fully self-confident and a bit combative, while also being rather anti-intellectual or shallow. The other character, Schopenhauer, is named Philalethes, the lover of Lethe, of forgetfulness or of death. And I think it's in Philalethes' views that we find something like a version of Schopenhauer's views, although not, given the dialogue form, not perhaps precisely what he thinks. A few months ago, as an experiment, I produced a side-by-side split-screen performance of this dialogue with me reading both sides, Philalethes on the left and Thrasymachus on the right, I believe. What I'm going to do now is to share that with you in place of my reading this dialogue. It's quite short. I will interrupt it twice for my commentary and explanations of what I think is going on, and then offer some comments at the end. So, here is my performance of Immortality, a Dialogue. Here we go. Tell me now, in one word, what shall I be after my death? And mind you be clear and precise. All and nothing. I thought so. I gave you a problem, and you solve it by contradiction. That's a very stale trick. Yes, but you raise transcendental questions, and you expect me to answer them in language that is only made for immanent knowledge. It's no wonder that a contradiction ensues. What do you mean by transcendental questions and immanent knowledge? I've heard these expressions before, of course. They're not new to me. The professor was fond of using them, but only as predicates of the deity, and he never talked of anything else, which was quite all right and proper. He argued thus: if the deity was the world itself, he was immanent, and if he was somewhere outside it, he was transcendent. Nothing could be clearer and more obvious. You knew where you were. But this Kantian rigmarole won't do anymore. It's antiquated and no longer applicable to modern ideas. Why, we've had a whole row of eminent men in the metropolis of German learning. German humbug, he means. The mighty Schleiermacher, for instance, and that gigantic intellect Hegel. And at this time of day, we've abandoned all that nonsense. I should rather say we're so far beyond it that we can't put up with it anymore. What's the use of it then? What does it all mean? Transcendental knowledge is knowledge which passes beyond the bounds of possible experience and strives to determine the nature of things as they are in themselves. Immanent knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge which confines itself entirely within those bounds, so that it cannot apply to anything but actual phenomena. As far as you are an individual, death will be the end of you. But your individuality is not your true and inmost being. It is only the outward manifestation of it. It is not the thing in itself, but only the phenomenon presented in the form of time, and therefore with a beginning and an end. But your real being knows neither time, nor beginning, nor end, nor yet the limits of any given individual. It is everywhere present in every individual, and no individual can exist apart from it. So when death comes, on the one hand, you are annihilated as an individual. On the other, you are and remain everything. And that is what I meant when I said that after your death, you will be all and nothing. It's difficult to find a more precise answer to your question and at the same time be brief. The answer is contradictory, I admit, but it is so simply because your life is in time and the immortal part of you in eternity. You may put the matter thus: your immortal part is something that does not last in time and yet is indestructible. But there you have another contradiction. You see what happens by trying to bring the transcendental within the limits of immanent knowledge. It is in some sort doing violence to the latter by misusing it for ends it was never meant to serve. My first comment. So, what's happening here at the beginning? We have this discussion situated in the midst of post Kantian debates in philosophy. We find one thinker, Thrasymachus, arguing that this Kantian rigmarole is antiquated, that Schleiermacher and Hegel have by far the superior philosophers, got beyond all that Kantian business now. We should recollect that Schopenhauer thinks quite highly of Kant. And then we have, amid this discussion of German humbug, Philalethes says, Philalethes' first long speech, where he draws a distinction between the transcendental and immanent knowledge. Transcendental knowledge is knowledge beyond the bounds of all possible experience, what we call the noumenal in Kant, and immanent knowledge is confined to the boundaries of phenomena. But, and here's the beginning of a theme that we'll see run through the rest of this short dialogue, your individuality is not your true and inmost being. I might say that's the key mistake that I think Schopenhauer is trying to identify, call our attention to, and correct in this dialogue. If he's teaching us anything, it's that that's a mistake. You are the you-ness of you is not the most important realist bit of you, your existence. Schopenhauer is inviting us to think in a radically different way about what it means to be an individual, much less a philosopher and an intellectual, thinking about one's own individuality. Your real being knows neither limits nor ends. The thing in itself he refers to here is, for Schopenhauer, the will. Right? Will with a capital W. There's this life force, this struggling and striving, which takes the form of individuals in this world and in this lifetime. And we might say that this mistake about individuality comes about because each of us is will contained in or expressed through the limited being of an individual, of a human being. But this individuality itself is, Schopenhauer might say elsewhere, a kind of mistake, right? And we are wrong to value it as highly as we do. So when death comes, you're annihilated as an individual, he says. But this is very difficult to talk about because we're trying to use transcendental categories to describe the sort of subjective experience of being a bit of will. So that's the end of my comment on this part. I'm going to let the two take it away for the middle part of the dialogue. Here we go. Look here, I shan't give tuppence for your immortality unless I'm to remain an individual. Well, perhaps I may be able to satisfy you on this point. Suppose I guarantee that after death you shall remain an individual, but only on condition that you first spend 3 months of complete unconsciousness. I shall have no objection to that. But remember, if people are completely unconscious, they take no account of time. So when you are dead, it's all the same to you whether 3 months pass in the world of consciousness or 10,000 years. In the one case, as in the other, it is simply a matter of believing what is told you when you awake. So far, then, you can afford to be indifferent whether it is 3 months or 10,000 years that pass before you recover your individuality. Yes, if it comes to that, I suppose you're right. And if by chance, after those 10,000 years have gone by, no one ever thinks of awakening you, I fancy it would be no great misfortune. You would have become quite accustomed to non existence after so long a spell of it, following upon such a very few years of life. At any rate, you may be sure that you would be perfectly ignorant of the whole thing. Further, if you knew that the mysterious power which keeps you in your present state of life had never once ceased in those 10,000 years to bring forth other phenomena like yourself and to endow them with life, it would fully console you. My second pause for comment, I just want to say that I'm not terribly impressed with Philolethes' reasoning in this middle part of the dialogue, his suggestion that you might remain an individual but spend 3 months spend 3 months unconscious. That actually is a bit of cleverness because, as Thrasymachus discovers after agreeing to this, being unconscious is really subjectively the same as being dead. You don't really form the idea of having been unconscious until you are conscious again, looking back over it, and you ask yourself, "How long was I out?" You reform your sense of self, taking into account the gap, whether it was 8 hours or 8 months, the gap in your consciousness. So that then invites Philolethes to make this point that, well, suppose you never woke up, right? Being unconscious forever would not be so terrible a thing as you might suppose. This idea of saying, well, you spend 10,000 years not existing, how would you even notice it? Seems to me a little bit glib. And this idea that you should be fully consoled by this almost feels like a little bit of playful banter. Like there's a sort of thinly disguised sophism going on here. You would have become accustomed to non-existence after so long a spell. I think some of that is said in at least partially in jest, and Thrasymachus, as we'll see in a moment, gets angry at it. So we'll go now into the last part of the dialogue, the last few pages. Thrasymachus gives his final response, demanding a defense of his individuality as a lasting part of his soul's indestructibility, and we'll get Philolethes' final response. Here it is. Indeed. So you think you're quietly going to do me out of my individuality with all this fine talk. But I'm up to your tricks. I tell you, I won't exist unless I have my individuality. I'm not going to be put off with mysterious powers and what you call phenomena. I can't do without my individuality, and I won't give it up. You mean, I suppose, that your individuality is such a delightful thing, so splendid, so perfect and beyond compare, that you can't imagine anything better. Aren't you ready to exchange your present state for one which, if we can judge by what is told us, may possibly be superior and more endurable? Don't you see that my individuality, be it what it may, is my very self? To me, it is the most important thing in the world. For God is God and I am I. I want to exist. I. That's the main thing. I don't care about an existence which has to be proved to be mine before I can believe it. Think what you're doing. When you say, I want to exist, it is not you alone that says this. Everything says it. Absolutely everything that has the faintest trace of consciousness. It follows then that this desire of yours is just the part of you that is not individual, the part that is common to all things without distinction. It is the cry not of the individual, but of existence itself. It is the intrinsic element in everything that exists. Nay, it is the cause of anything existing at all. This desire craves for, and so is satisfied with, nothing less than existence in general, not any definite individual existence. No, that is not its aim. It seems to be so only because this desire, this will, attains consciousness only in the individual, and therefore looks as though it were concerned with nothing but the individual. But there lies the illusion. An illusion, it is true, in which the individual is held fast, but if he reflects, he can break the fetters and set himself free. It is only indirectly, I say, that the individual has this violent craving for existence. It is the will to live which is the real and direct aspirant, alike and identical in all things. Since then, existence is the free work, nay, the mere reflection of the will. Where existence is, there too must be will. And for the moment the will finds itself in existence itself, so far I mean as that which never rests, but presses forward eternally, can ever find any satisfaction at all. The will is careless of the individual. The individual is not its business, although, as I've said, this seems to be the case, because the individual has no direct consciousness of will except in himself. The effect of this is to make the individual careful to maintain his own existence. And if this were not so, there would be no surety for the preservation of the species. From all this, it is clear that individuality is not a form of perfection, but rather of limitation. And so to be freed from it is not loss, but gain. Trouble yourself no more about the matter. Once thoroughly recognize what you are and what your existence really is, namely, the universal will to live, and the whole question will seem to you childish and most ridiculous. You're childish yourself and most ridiculous, like all philosophers. And if a man of my age lets himself in for a quarter of an hour's talk with such fools, it is only because it amuses me and passes the time. I've more important business to attend to. So, goodbye. My final comment. That's the end of the dialogue. And we have this great expression Thrasymachus uses, right? I want to exist. You're not gonna trick me out of my individuality. Tell me that I will live forever and continue to exist, but not as an individual, unless I am myself. I am Robert or Arthur or Christopher or Jessica. Unless it's that very individual person who continues to exist, then all the rest of this is just wordplay. Because the kind of existence that I have to prove is mine after I have it doesn't attract me. But I think Philolethes' final speech here is about the clearest expression of something like this Schopenhauerian view of the afterlife, or of the indestructibility of the soul, so to speak. The character of the soul under this broad metaphysics of will, where the thing in itself, the fundamental reality about human life, is will or striving or struggle. And of course, the wise thing to do is to back off from that, to escape from the pull and the misery of will and struggle. So, what does Philolethes say here? When you say, I want to exist, you are not the only one who says that. Everyone says that. Everyone wants to be themselves, wants to be I. You and me and him and her, the dog, the worm, the insect. Everything wants to continue being itself, meaning that this desire of yours is just the part of you that is not individual. Okay, that's clever. I wonder if it's not a little bit too clever. It is the part that is common to all things. What do all things want? All things want to go on being themselves. And so, what is it that's unique about you? Well, it's not your desire to go on being you, unless you think, as he says previously here, you think that your precious individuality is so important that it's worth better beyond that. There's nothing, no possible state of existence afterwards or after this life that could possibly be superior to it. The suggestion again here being there's a mistake on your part, motivated by, or sort of driven by, your mistake about yourself and your being, that because of your faulty metaphysics, because you haven't realized the true nature of will and struggle in human life. The desire that craves for and is satisfied nothing less than existence in general, not any individual definite existence. This ties in with things that Schopenhauer has said elsewhere in this book, that will itself wants the whole, it wants everything. And so it can't be satisfied with any finite lifespan, with anything that I can achieve in this life. And even the sort of preservation of this life immortally would not satisfy will. Will would still be frustrated, would still be sort of struggling and striving towards something further. It seems to be this way only because will attains consciousness only in the individual, and therefore it looks as though it were concerned with nothing but the individual. So what's happened here? Each of us is a manifestation of will. Every living thing is a manifestation of will, including social insects like ants, including my dog, every human being. They all are will. fundamentally. But when will takes the shape of a human being with a reflective intellect, the ability to think about and sort of cognize about itself to become self-conscious, well, in that unique case, will has taken the form of an individual. And therefore, whenever will is doing the thinking thing about itself, it's thinking about its individual reality in that particular person. But since you and I are nothing but will having taken the temporary form of an individual, it is a mistake for us to think that our individuality is part of the thing in itself, part of our sort of inmost realist being, such that I would be frustrated if I did not get to be Christopher in the afterlife, or if Robert did not get to be Robert in the afterlife. I'd say that's kind of a cheat, right? Didn't he lose out on that? Schopenhauer is suggesting here that really individuation is a kind of limitation of will that will be transcended. You will throw off the finitude of individuality at death, and that's something to be looked forward to, not to be lamented. The effect of this, let's see. Individuality is not a form of perfection, but rather a form of limitation. That's about as clearly as it can be put. To be freed from it is not loss, but gain. And the dialogue, of course, ends then with the exchange of insults. Thrasymachus says, I have no more time for this. This is childish and foolish in the extreme. I'm not in any way convinced, which is just what one might expect from a dialogue with a character named Thrasymachus. So that's my quick look, sharing with you this essay from Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism. The next section of Studies in Pessimism is a long section of short psychological observations. We'll look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.